The horror genre is one of the most infamous film genres out there, as well as the one with perhaps the most interesting history behind it. And today, I would like to take a trip down memory lane and explore that history in detail. But before we get started, I would just like to note that this isn't going to be like most of my other videos where I either explore a topic objectively or give my opinion on it. This video is much more of a history lesson, with me mostly just stating facts. So if this isn't really your kind of video, please feel free to skip over it and tune into the next one. Alright, so with all of that out of the way, let's get right into it. Now, going all the way back to the dawn of cinema in the silent era, horror wasn't used very often, and with most movies being comedies, melodramas, or westerns, this isn't too surprising. In fact, the only two horror movies that were really successful during this period were Nosferatu, a German film no less, and of course, The Phantom of the Opera. Now, one of the reasons behind horror's failure to catch on was because the studios were very hesitant to depict the supernatural and fantastical on screen. And if they did, it usually turned out that there was a logical explanation behind it. So, in other words, most of the horror movies that were made in the silent era were almost like quiet and more serious versions of Scooby-Doo. And this is also a major reason why the Phantom of the Opera stood out, because even in the source material, the Phantom is actually just a normal, if disfigured, man, and thus no contrivances that would have otherwise ruined the movie had to be added to the script. However, once the talkies came out, all of that was about to change, from a little studio known as Universal. Now, you see, the head of the studio, Carl Laemmle, and please forgive me if I'm not pronouncing that right, was infamous for his nepotism. If you were a relative of his, you were basically guaranteed a job at the studio whether you were qualified for it or not. And unfortunately, most of them weren't. However, one relative that was actually very good at his job was his son, Carl Laemmle Jr., and moreover, he had a fascination with horror. So in 1929, right after the sound movies had taken over the movie industry, Laemmle Jr. pitched an idea to do a sweeping epic adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula. Now, most of the executives, including his own father, were hesitant with such an idea. And unfortunately, the Great Depression then came around and seemingly put an end to it, as the studio refused to invest so much money in something that wasn't a proven hit with audiences. However, Laemmle Jr.'s hope in doing an adaptation of Dracula was renewed when somebody suggested that they do an adaptation of the 1926 stage play instead, which would be much cheaper to make and thus not be a huge risk to the studio. But even after all of that, the executives were still a little reluctant to go ahead with it. But ultimately, the project was given the green light, with Laemmle Jr. serving as producer and overseeing production. After that, the production really only hit one snag, which was that the first choice for the role of Dracula, Lon Chaney, died right before he was to be cast in the part. So as a result, the part was given to a little-known actor who had previously played Dracula in the stage adaptation, Bela Lugosi. The movie was finally released in 1931. And the success was unprecedented. The public went to see it in droves and were absolutely amazed by what they had seen. A true depiction of the supernatural, combined with Bela Lugosi's terrifying performance as the undead vampire, completely captivated the general public of 1931. And most notably, it was Universal's highest grossing movie of that year. With such impressive results, Lamell Jr. was instantly given the go-ahead to produce more horror films, and Bela Lugosi became a huge star almost overnight. Frankenstein was then released later that same year, which was also a huge success and made an overnight star out of its monster, Boris Karloff, as well. And for the next 4 years, Universal was the absolute king of the horror movie. It seemed that they could do no wrong as far as the public was concerned, and they wanted plenty of it. For whatever reason, people of the Great Depression seemed to love being scared by monsters and restrained gore. Now, Universal released several horror movies that instantly became classics, but the three that stand out the most from this time period were Dracula, Frankenstein, and The Mummy. Again, there were many other movies, but those were the ones that achieved the highest level of notoriety and acclaim. Now, other studios tried to duplicate the success of Universal with their own horror films, but none ever got anywhere near the same results. Though some film experts believe that Paramount got the closest, releasing a few horror films that still hold up quite well to this day, and were noted to be absolutely terrifying in the early 1930s, such as Murders in the Zoo or Island of Lost Souls. And no matter the studio, it came to be expected that you'd see either one of two faces as the villain or monster of most of these films, with that being either Boris Karloff or Bela Lugosi. With both of them at the top of their game and popularity, they continued to terrify audiences time and time again, whether it was Karloff's more tragic monsters such as Frankenstein's monster, or Lugosi's more pure evil, remorseless, and sadistic villains like Dracula. Though different in style, they were both considered the undisputed kings of horror. So the point here is, horror was all the rage in the early 1930s. Universal made millions of dollars. Frederick March won an Academy Award for playing Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, still one of the only times an actor's ever won for a horror film. And various monsters from obscure books went on to define not only horror, but pop culture as a whole, essentially making Halloween what it is today in the process. But then, just as quickly as it had taken off, it all came crashing down, and that mainly happened for two reasons. The first was because the infamous Hays Code, which was very strict on censorship and what could and couldn't be shown on screen in movies, was introduced in 1934 and quickly enforced. Really? The last Universal horror film released before the code cracked down was actually the first pairing between Lugosi and Karloff, The Black Cat, which is also been cited by many as the first psychological horror movie. But after that, Universal and everybody else were very limited in what they could show. And the second reason was because Carl Lammel was forced out of Universal in a hostile takeover in 1935 after being personally involved in a string of flops. And with him also went Carl Lammel Jr., who, as I mentioned earlier, was the real mastermind behind those horror movies. The last horror movie released with his involvement was Bride of Frankenstein in 1935, which is considered by many to be the last real hurrah for both Universal and the horror genre as a whole, as it would never reach that level of mainstream popularity again. So with the Hays Code now in full swing, most other studios quickly abandoned the horror genre, though Universal tried to keep up their success, only to be repeatedly met with failure without Lamell Jr. Almost overnight, horror movies became as rare as Tasmanian tigers, with Universal being the only ones trying to keep it going and reclaim their former glory. However, they only managed to do it twice, with Son of Frankenstein, as well as the 1941 classic The Wolf Man, which was the only movie that managed to recapture the magic of their early 30s movies and became a classic on par with their best. But other than that, any and all attempts to repopularize the horror genre was only met with disappointment for both the audience and the box office. By the 1940s, the horror genre was dead. Only extremely obscure Poverty Row studios continued to release them, and they were usually about as bad as you could imagine. And as a result of this, Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff both had extreme problems finding work, as they both found it impossible to break their earlier typecasting and often had to resort to taking work from these Poverty Row studios for any kind of paycheck. And at this point, the horror comedy had become rather popular with the public, having been popularized by a few Bob Hope movies released in 1939 and 1940. So if there was anything with horror attached to it, chances are it was much more funny than scary. And even Universal, who were still stubbornly trying to bring back the true horror genre and proved to be the only studio still interested in Karloff and Lugosi, couldn't help but jump on this bandwagon a bit. And this is perhaps most evident with The Invisible Man. In 1933, it was a rather terrifying horror movie, but just 7 years later, in 1940, The Invisible Woman had become a comedy, making a constant joke out of the fact that the woman has to walk around naked in order to be truly invisible. But with that being said, by 1942, Universal realized that they would need a new gimmick in order to get people interested in horror again, as being scary just wasn't enough anymore. So they introduced quite possibly the first use of it out there, that being the shared universe. Basically, they announced that all of their horror movies had taken place in the same universe, and went on to do a bunch of crossover horror movies where the different monsters would meet each other and fight. And while most definitely an interesting new idea with the public that did indeed get them some attention, it still didn't have the results Universal was hoping it would. So, after doing a few of those and failing to recapture their success of the early 1930s, in the late 40s, Universal had a new idea, which was to combine the idea of the shared universe as well as the popularity of the horror comedy. And the result was a crossover between the horror movie monsters and Abbott and Costello. And surprisingly enough, this gamble actually paid off, causing them to crank out a total of 4 movies which proved insanely popular and were Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff's most successful movies in almost a decade. Now, some at the time argued that these movies killed the horror genre, which is kind of ironic considering it had been dead for a long time already, because nobody would ever be able to take them seriously again. But in a few years, they would be proven very wrong about that. But before that happened, horror was essentially off the table. Nobody but the poorest of studios were dishing them out, other than the very occasional oddball, so they were usually of very bad quality when they did come out. But then in 1953, a movie came out that finally aroused interest in the horror genre again. Only, it wasn't Universal that finally brought it back, but Warner Brothers. House of Wax was released starring Vincent Price, and while the 3D aspect was its main selling point, that's not what people walked away talking about. But I think I'll say it in Price's own words. I'm going to give the people what they want. Sensation, horror, shock. Send them out in the streets to tell their friends how wonderful it is to be scared to death. And that's exactly what they did. Once again, horror had proved to be a viable genre with the public. Now, Universal was obviously quick to get right back into it, but really only managed to create one new classic, Creature from the Black Lagoon. As it turned out, while the public was interested in horror again, it wasn't to the insane extent that it had been in the 30s. But at around the same time they were finding this out, some horror studios had taken note of what had happened to a newly emerged genre, the science fiction movie. And what they found from them was that mainstream audiences had only a passing or no interest in it, but that it did have a small group of people who were extremely loyal to it, and they usually proved enough to make a profit off of them. So these poorer studios, and even some of the bigger ones, started using similar tactics with horror, deliberately trying to turn it into a cult genre like science fiction. And they very much succeeded in that task. So as a result, the genre was brought back, but wasn't taken too seriously by most people, in part because it had become considered a B genre by most in the industry. And unfortunately, Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff weren't able to capitalize on horror's resurgence to boost their careers either, as they were no longer bankable stars except for those who were nostalgic for the Universal horror movies of the 30s. Though to Lugosi's credit, he is sometimes credited with helping House of Wax become a success through his promotion of it, and Karloff did go on to voice the Grinch, so it wasn't all bad for them either. But now, there were two horror movie villain icons for a new generation, which came in the form of Vincent Price and Christopher Lee. As is still widely known, Price became an instant favorite in the genre, especially after it went cult, because of the success of House of Wax, while Christopher Lee became huge after signing on with Hammer Horror, perhaps the most famous horror movie studio ever, in 1957. And while obviously Lee was eventually able to escape that genre and become famous for more mainstream stuff, Price would spend pretty much the rest of his career associated with horror, though by his own admission he was fine with that. So after that, through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the horror genre was still around and being made by many, but it was still strictly a B genre that usually wasn't of very high quality beyond the casting. Then in the late 70s and early 80s, the slasher film took off with teenagers everywhere, briefly causing the genre to reach mainstream heights again. Unfortunately, this proved to just be a momentary fad, mainly because these movies, such as Halloween, Friday the 13th, and Nightmare on Elm Street, were quickly bogged down by increasingly convoluted and bad sequels, tarnishing the original's legacy and seemingly only proving that horror would never be anything but a B genre. And this was only reinforced by the 90s and 2000s, where horror reached its absolute lowest point. The scripts were horrible, they relied on gore and jump scares for everything, and overall represented filmmaking at its absolute worst. At that point in time, horror was considered the absolute bottom of the barrel, and you'd only need to see one or two movies to see why. Now, some have argued that horror has had another resurgence in the 2010s, with more talented filmmakers taking the helm, a few movies managing to reach mainstream popularity, and Universal once again trying to capitalize on their horror monsters of the 30s to try and compete with the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But at this point, only time will tell if this is the real deal or if it's just another fad. Though even if something did become of it, it would still have to go a long way before the genre reached the heights it had in the early 30s again. Now, sure, horror has had quite a few masterpieces released since its mainstream popularity ended in the mid 1930s, but if you notice, they usually tend to be made by people that don't normally work within the genre. For example, Alfred Hitchcock was known for light-hearted thrillers when he made Psycho. Stanley Kubrick had done a wide variety of genres before he did The Shining. And Jonathan Demme specialized a lot more in dramas before he did The Silence of the Lambs. In other words, ever since being rendered a B genre in the 1950s, horror has had an extreme problem getting good filmmakers to work on them, which is why when somebody of actual talent does, it manages to stand out so much. And that's also why some believe horror movies have become more prominent recently, because talented filmmakers are focusing on them a lot more. But the point here is, the horror genre has never been able to reclaim the popularity of its glory days. In the early 1930s, they were the most prominent revolutionary films out there, but for a long time now it's been viewed as a sub-quality genre with an occasional good movie, and that's unfortunately not too far from the truth. But as I said before, only time will tell if horror may one day reclaim its former glory. But either way, you still have to admit it had one heck of a fall from grace, and that it would take a lot for it to ever become such a huge mainstream pop culture phenomenon again. And of course, what also doesn't help is that horror is a lot more subjective than other movie genres. In other words, looking at its complicated history, it's safe to say that horror may very well never be what it once was. But there's always still a chance, I guess. Okay, I think that ends our little history lesson. So now I want to hear how you felt about all this. Do you believe the horror genre will never reach the heights it had in the 1930s, or do you believe it already has? Please feel free to let me know what you think in the comments below. And thank you all for watching. It is very greatly appreciated, and I hope to see you all next time.